Welcome to the SportsPro Podcast.
Hi everyone, and welcome once again to the SportsPro Podcast. My name is Eoin Connolly. I'm the editor-at-large at SportsPro. Hope you're well. Very good to have you back, and very good to have back as well for the first time in 2021. SportsPro digital editor Tom Bassam. Hi Tom.
Hi Eoin.
And SportsPro deputy editor Sam Carp. Hi Sam.
Hi Eoin, how are you doing?
Not bad, Sam, not bad. All things considered, lots to consider right about now in this part of the world. But yeah, ticking along. How about you?
I'm, similar, just ticking along, but looking forward to the next 45 minutes or so.
Yeah, looking forward to the next 45 minutes in which we will be, in a kind of roundabout way, looking forward to the rest of 2021. I think we're still in the permissible zone for annual previews at this point in January. And what we're going to do is we're going to reflect on SportsPro's annual list of the 10 influencers. Important note to start with that these are 10 of the most influential people in sport in the year ahead. It's by no means a power ranking. Really, it's about identifying some of the people who are going to be close to the big trends and the big storylines of 2021. With that disclaimer out of the way, we can go into the list, and just to prove it's not a ranking, we're going to approach them thematically and kind of group some people together over the next 45 minutes or so. Tom, to start with, we have two women who are going to be quite heavily involved, we think, in some of the more kind of evolutionary aspects of how sports media works in the next 12 months. Marie Donohue, who of course appeared at the SportsPro OTT Summit just before Christmas. She's the Vice President of Global Sports Video at Amazon. And Erica Nardini, the Chief Executive of Barstool Sports. Let's start with Amazon. Obviously, they've got a very big year ahead, potentially.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this year is it's kind of an acceleration year for Amazon in many respects. I think it's from the start of the next football season. They take up the Champions League rights in a couple of territories. They've also been acquiring cricket rights in India, although I think that might be further down the line. And obviously, they've been sort of working away on the tennis Premier League front for a little while. But you get the impression that Amazon's now kind of kicking into the next phase of its development, and at the top of this, sort of driving that, you've got Marie Donohue, who, as you said, spoke at SportsPro OTT Summit at the end of last year.
Yeah, and I feel important to mention to everyone as well that, of course, all of these names, if you want to read along at home, are available on sportspromedia.com and in the new issue of SportsPro magazine, which Mike is just putting the finishing touches to now. Sam, I guess one of the reasons that Amazon's story is so interesting this year is that, as Tom mentioned, we know the rights that they have, and they've been quite kind of opportunistic in the way that they've approached some of those acquisitions in the last few years. But two deals potentially, well, one certainly coming up very soon, we think, and one perhaps in the few months after that, with two deals with rights holders who they've already been working with, the NFL and the Premier League. And we're going to see what they make of what they've been doing so far, basically.
Yeah, I think that's what's kind of particularly interesting. Obviously, as you said, they've kind of been dipping their toe in the market so far. So this is almost one of the first years where we're really going to see, are they going to double down on what's happened so far? Are they going to are they happy with what they've got, or are they going to expand and kind of go after a little bit more? So with the Premier League, for example, obviously the big thing with the package of rights that they've had at the moment was that it fell in December, so it was quite convenient for them to kind of drive subscriptions to Prime at that time of year. But if they're happy with what they've been seeing, the way people have been sort of interacting with that content, there might be reason for them to possibly kind of go after a bigger package. And similarly with the NFL, but I think the talk with the NFL has been that most people are sort of expecting that it'll be sort of the legacy media players that sort of fight to keep what they've got. But also at the same time, Amazon has been linked with the Sunday ticket package. There's also been talk of them maybe exclusively getting that Thursday night football that they've got at the moment. But yeah, I think those two particular properties in particular, how they approach those is going to be a good indication of kind of what Amazon has seen so far, how successful they view it as being, and whether they are sort of kind of really viewing this as kind of like a long-term proposition for their subscribers.
And of course, Tom, Amazon is showing us one vision of the future of media, and it's kind of it's a take on the pay TV model that we've seen for the last few decades. They're in a bit of a battle in the entertainment space with the likes of Netflix and Disney. They obviously have this enormous retail operation behind them, and Amazon Web Services as well, which is kind of a license to print money. So what they do in sport is a part of that machine, but basically it's about getting people to pay for access to live sport. Eric and Nardini and Barstool Sports are coming at it in a way that kind of it has more of its roots within digital media. You're looking at betting, you're looking at communities, podcasts, kind of new media angles, new media takes on what sports media can be.
Yeah, it's an interesting one with Erica Nardini. She joined Barstool. I think it was like 4 years ago, maybe 5, and she's kind of putting a mature face on what can sometimes be a bit of a childish looking media operation, at least in terms of their sort of their content output, anyway. But there's nothing kind of immature about the way that they've gone about growing that. I mean, like they've got a huge podcast network. I did a big feature on podcast last year, and actually, I kind of one of the major regrets of that was omitting a bit more coverage of Barstool, because what they've done there is pretty incredible. They know their audience really well, and the sports betting stuff in the US really couldn't have come around at a better time for them, I don't think. So just as kind of there's deregulation happening in that sector, they've got a perfect crossover, because they have that market, they have that kind of appeal to the kind of people that will be spending money in that area. So it was no surprise when they got that investment from Penn Gaming a couple of years ago, and I think what we're seeing is them just leaning more and more into that sports gambling element of sports fandom. Like it makes a lot of sense. It's going to be opening up wildly in the next few years, I think.
Yeah, and I think it shows as well, if you, as you say, if you understand who your community is and what they want, you don't necessarily have to be appealing to everybody, but if you can put that fan in the middle of an environment that they can explore, and you can find ways of making money out of that, basically, whether that's advertising through podcasts or digital content, or increasingly direct monetization through betting, then you can, if you get the model right, you can kind of keep scaling that up and scaling that up.
Yeah, and also people will be coming to them asking how they can pull off similar tricks, and the more sort of facets you're able to add to it. I mean, if someone wants to go to Barstool and say, "How do we access this group of fans?" they're able to say, "You do this, and you can pay us this much money, and we'll show you how."
Will be interesting to see how much further they can grow and what the limits are of the kind of editorial texture, I guess, of what they're doing, to put it politely.
I mean, you should also point out at this point that aside from just Barstool in itself, Erica Nardini is a fairly interesting character in that she came from a fairly traditional background in business. I think she previously worked for Yahoo, and then she took a bit of a risk in joining a company fronted by, at that time, Dave Portnoy, and probably still fronted by Dave Portnoy, who's a bit of a loudmouth. Kind of, you wouldn't look at a place at a MAGA rally, basically. But she's able to present a good face for it, and she's been appointed to the board of WWE. So I mean, maybe there'll be some crossover there. Yeah, I mean, I think when Penn invested in the company, it was valued at 450 million. I mean, there's no reason why that can't shoot up a lot more.
You're listening to the SportsPro Podcast.
Let's move on and talk a bit about the rights holder side of the picture. We've got 3 in the list: Brian Roloff, who's the Chief Media and Business Officer of the NFL; Arnaud Rouget, who is the Chief Executive of France's Professional Football League; and Stefano Domenicali, who is the incoming Chief Executive of Formula One. We'll start with Brian Roloff because there's some crossover between what we've just been talking about on the media side. The NFL, well, I mean, there's almost nothing they don't touch, I guess, in sports media, particularly in the US. but they're a part of that conversation with Amazon. They're a part of that conversation with Barstool, but they're part of the biggest conversation this year, which is, these incoming media deals that they've got. They might be for the next 10 years. They will be, we think, the biggest ever signed by any rights holder. And Tom, there's a lot of elements to this. It's going to have a knock-on effect for the rest of the broadcast industry. It's also going to tell us a little bit about what the NFL's priorities are, and as a kind of consequence of that, what the rest of the industry should be watching, I guess. And Brian Roloff is the guy developing those deals.
Yeah, I think he'll probably be the guy that takes credit for signing off like maybe double-digit billions of pounds worth of media rights contracts, which will, by all accounts, reset the market. Yeah, I think we'll see an NFL future where it's not going to look too different from what they have now in terms of how they distribute. They've always prioritized reach, so that's free to air, or at least kind of regular transmission, over putting content behind a paywall. Yeah, I think the interesting thing for me with the next NFL rights deal will be what they do with that Sunday ticket package, because that's the one where it's probably got the most interest for new media companies, and which route they decide to go down. I mean, I think probably most of the people expect it'll be Amazon, but DAZN is also there. People have also mentioned Apple. I don't know so much about that. They haven't made any previous investments in sport, so you could see it either way. You could see them going, okay, yeah, if we're going to make an investment, so we might as well do it properly, or they could just sit it out and wait for another round. But yeah, it does. I think at the end of it, yeah, Brian Roloff will be one of those people that just comes out of it looking like a very seasoned executive.
And he's been talked about as well. If we're discussing internal candidates, he's been discussed fleetingly as a potential successor to Roger Goodell, who signed this new contract, basically, I think, to take us to this side of these media rights deals in 2017. So, his contract expires, I think, in 2023, which will allow all of those partnerships to come on stream. But really, this is it's a two-part conversation, isn't it? It's what the future of the NFL is, and it's then, we're going to see a very big rights deal, and perhaps for the first time in certainly the last 10, 15 years or so, the reaction of everybody else is going to not be, oh, look, media companies are spending lots of money on rights. It's going to be, oh, no, they've spent all this on the NFL. How much have they got left?
Yeah, that was, I think, hinted at during the OTT summit by John Miller from NBC. So yeah, I mean, it could shift, like you say, what happens in the rest of the US sports media market, like who has money to spend in what. There was a report recently that Fox, I think that what they're going to have to spend to retain their existing Sunday package means that they might not be able to afford the Thursday package, which opens that up for someone else, but probably suggests to you the kind of level of spending that it's going to take to get these deals over the line. With Brian Roloff, it's interesting as well, because I don't think that people actually probably know too much about him and what kind of commissioner, if he is the next commissioner, what kind of commissioner he could even be. But I guess from the NFL's perspective, they want someone in that position who is capable of making big money for the league.
Yeah, I mean, that's conversation for another day, really. But, Roger Goodell has been kind of indivisible from NFL leadership for a very long time, for all that that's worth. And I think that in this country, we've just been through a change of leadership in the Premier League and ended up, after a fashion, we've ended up with the steadiest pair of hands internally. But I think the NFL, they're facing a pretty similar set of questions, Sam, in terms of it's not just the transition to a new media phase. There are a lot of internal things that need to be dealt with, whether that's in the NFL's case, things like concussion, things like some of the outward facing aspects, I guess, of the league's image and participation as well, I should say.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose last year we sort of saw them try and address some of those things in a way. Obviously, I guess they didn't really have much choice, given particularly in reaction to kind of the protests in the US following the killing of George Floyd. They completely changed their stance on athlete protests. They were wrong not to listen to the black athletes within their league in the past. So there are signs that kind of they are open to change, which maybe you wouldn't always associate with the NFL. You kind of associate it with being quite a stubborn organisation. Not one that is kind of like that does have much empathy, perhaps, but maybe there were signs that was starting to change last year. And I suppose going forward, that as you mentioned, some of those kind of other issues, sorts of things they're going to have to start addressing as well.
And we may see at some point this year a resumption of its international program as well. Someone dealing, guys, with the flip side of the media rights conundrum at the moment is Arnaud Rouget, who's the chief executive of the Ligue Professionnelle de Football, professional football league in France, the operator of Ligue 1. They are having a very different set of conversations right now after the collapse, Tom, of their landmark broadcast rights deal with MediaPro.
Yeah, influencer is an interesting way of framing Arno. I'm not trying to tempt your pronunciation, Owen. Because his influence will be more of a scramble job, I think, probably at this point. A lot of clubs in France will have preemptively started spending that money that they thought they were going to be getting from MediaPro. I think it was something like a 65% increase on their previous rights deal. I could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure that's the figure. Some of that would already have gone on wages and transfers, and now it doesn't. Now that is not going to come. So Mr. Rouget has the job of basically salvaging what could be a tricky next couple of years for the French clubs. There was reports today that Bordeaux was already in financial difficulties. Lille had to be sold to a private equity firm just before Christmas after the contract had collapsed. So it's already kind of a struggle, should we say, in Ligue 1 at the moment.
And I mean, in European football generally, there's a pretty direct correlation between rights income and, as you say, expenditure, mostly on salaries and transfer fees and player costs, basically. And there had been some optimism in France that this MediaPro deal would bring them up a category, probably alongside the Bundesliga, just below the Premier League in terms of its medium term financial power. Obviously, there will be buyers for those rights, but Canal Plus is understood to be, how do we put this equitably? They are not going to be charitable, basically, in terms of the deal that they end up signing. So there's going to have to be some belt tightening, and obviously stadiums have been closed, so that's a huge part of clubs' income that is already off stream. And Sam, the knock-on effects, I guess, in European football will be mostly connected with the transfer market. There'll be lots to talk about the availability of players in those French clubs, but of course, French clubs spend their money elsewhere. That will create some cash flow issues potentially elsewhere in the ecosystem.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's interesting. I think there have been a few articles already, kind of preempting that. Premier League clubs, for example, the vultures are circling. I suppose you could say, looking at French clubs for bargains, and if some of that talent does leave, what does that also mean for the future value of the media rights in the French league? If the product kind of ultimately goes down because some of those players are going. And yeah, as you say, if the French clubs don't have the money to spend, then ultimately some of the other leagues in the ecosystem that do kind of sell their players to Liga aren't going to be receiving some cash themselves. But I think what's also interesting about this is that we've seen private equity firms, CVC, getting involved with Serie A. There's talk of a number of private equity firms looking at the Bundesliga's international rights. Could further down the line, maybe we see them view Liga as a potential opportunity, especially with kind of things in flux at the moment. With that kind of is that kind of the environment where you might see a private equity firm? We talk about the vultures circling. Is that kind of the environment where they would sort of spy a deal and possibly see an opportunity to build up that value again and kind of make a contribution in the way that they see they might be able to with Serie A and the Bundesliga?
Yeah, distressed asset. Of course, historically, over the last 10 years, there has been a lot of Qatari money in French football, both with the purchase of Paris Saint-Germain and the money inward investment through beIN Sports on the right side. Maybe we'll see more of that, certainly on the kind of club by club basis. And of course, I guess the other conversation that Arno is going to have to manage is with the French government, particularly if there are further closures of venues. And we've seen in this country how difficult football has it dealing with central government and asking them for a contribution, loans and bailouts. And French clubs have already had quite a few over the last year. So it's going to be a delicate job over the next 12 months. Speaking of which, Stefano Domenicali, the former team principal at Ferrari, is joining Formula One as chief executive. There are a lot of people to please, Sam, in that particular space.
Yes, I think we've already seen some of the challenges he's going to have to navigate this year. Just literally today, only this morning, it was announced that they've had to postpone the Australian and Chinese Grand Prix because of COVID. Now starting the season in Bahrain on 28th of March, which does just kind of reiterate the fact that this year is it's going to be as challenging as the last, especially for these global touring sports properties that do want to stage events in different pockets of the world where there are so many different restrictions, varying circumstances. But Formula One did prove last year that it was able to carry on. I'm not sure many people expected them to stage the 17 races that they did. So if they are still confident of delivering their record, 23 races, who are we to kind of doubt them after what they pulled off in 2020? But as you say, kind of the more pertinent thing is that it is, we are entering a massive period of transition for Formula One. Obviously, kind of Chase Carey, one of the last things he did as chief executive was to get all 10 teams signed up to the new Concord agreement, which comes into effect this year. There's the reduced budget cap of $145 million as well. And then you've got a new set of technical regulations coming into the sport from 2022. As we know, all of this has kind of been with an eye on closing the gap in the sport from a competitive and financial standpoint. And as you kind of alluded to there, you naturally imagine that might create some friction. Obviously, you've got the big guns like Mercedes who have been used to dominating the sport in recent years. They might not like the fact that things are, maybe going to be a little bit tighter from now on. And there's the knock-on effect of the pandemic as well. He's going to have to convince a lot of these teams that it is still a viable investment for them, and convince them that it is sort of still worthwhile competing in the series, and that they can kind of create more of a balance in the sport. So yeah, he's got a big job on his hands. But I think it's interesting that you balance it. You've had the years of Chase Carey now, who kind of had this media background, and I suppose his tenure was very much about kind of injecting fresh life into F1 through marketing campaigns, digital initiatives like the esports series, Drive to Survive, the OTT service, all of these things implemented to varying degrees of success, but things that kind of needed to be done to make the sport relevant to a wider audience. And then I suppose now with Domenicali coming in, the focus is really going to be on the implementation of these rules, these regulations, the on-track stuff. And in him, they've got a guy who has this background in motorsport, who has served as Ferrari team principal. So I guess you'd say, he knows how the paddock works. He's a racing man. And yeah, I think a lot of the noise coming out of the sport is, that the likes of Lewis Hamilton, McLaren chief executive Zak Brown were all sort of in support of the appointment when it happened. So, I think they've kind of put their future in the hands of a man who kind of knows how the sport operates.
I think the big challenge for Formula One, the media side of it is interesting because there was a lot they could do with it, and there remains a lot they can do with it. But because of its positioning, it's the blue ribboned series in motorsport. It's the kind of accessible championship. Everybody knows at least one of the drivers, but lots of people know the drivers, and they'll know the circuits, and they'll know what is at stake. But over the next 10 years, Formula One is going to be dealing with quite dramatic changes in the car industry and mobility more generally, with petrol cars being phased out in a lot of markets, different kinds of urban transport coming in, which creates challenges from an R&D perspective. It's got its own commitment to zero carbon by 2030. In amongst all that, it has to decide, okay, well, if that's what we're doing, how do we continue to differentiate ourselves from the Formula E's and Extreme E's? How do we differentiate ourselves from any number of new series that might emerge in the next few years, and how do we maintain that standing?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's interesting, especially now, because you do have, manufacturers are I think they're looking across the ecosystem quite a bit now, and they are making decisions about what is still relevant to them and relevant to their future. I mean, this morning or yesterday, I think it was, McLaren secured an option about possibly joining Formula E. I think it's from the 2022-23 season. Obviously, doesn't commit them to joining, but gives them the option to do so. And I think, and out of Formula E, you've just had BMW and Audi leave. So there are a lot of manufacturers sort of knocking about who are looking at these series, and I think that with Formula One, as you say, they're not going to necessarily stick around unless they can see the series kind of going in a direction that aligns with their objectives. So while I think this year Dominicali maybe won't be focused necessarily on that 2030 target that they've set themselves, I think going forward it's definitely going to have to become a priority, because kind of remaining relevant is what's going to keep those manufacturers around.
Get the very best of SportsPro sent straight to your inbox. Head to sportspromedia.com and sign up for the SportsPro Daily. You'll get a roundup of all the biggest stories, features, and opinion from our team every single morning. You'll find that all and much more at sportspromedia.com. SportsPro, connecting and inspiring the business world of sport.
We've talked about private investment. We've talked about money coming from outside of sport. Nick Clary, the managing partner of CVC Capital Partners, Tom, is a man who's been spending a lot of it, or at least committing a lot of it, to new projects in the last year. What do we expect from him over the next 12 months?
I think with CVC, it's less over the next kind of 12 months and more over the next 5 years or 10 years. They seem to have kind of slightly rewritten how long private equity companies were willing to invest in stuff. They were invested in Formula One for more than 10 years. And during that time, they absolutely bled it dry. It'd be interesting to see if they take a similar approach with their investments in sport, like in rugby and football, and the other, all of the kind of other areas really that they've been linked to. That was when they picked apart the pieces of Formula One, when Liberty Media came in and acquired it. There was clearly so much to be done there because of the focus on driving profits for CVC, and at the expense of trying to create a modern sports rights holder. I don't think that they could do that with rugby. I don't think it would. It wouldn't work out in the same way for them. But they've also probably had to revise down some of their estimations on what they wanted to do with it as a result of the pandemic. I mean, quite a lot of these talks and what they were going to do with rugby were about the potential of rugby before we had a year of the sport without any fans in it. And that's probably affected why some of the deals haven't closed yet. Six Nations being the one I'm thinking of.
Although we understand, I think it was the Mail today reporting that Six Nations deal might be quite close to the line now, and as you say, a bit more certainty over when full venues might be possible again. I think you raise an important point there, which is, Formula One, as we discussed briefly when we were talking about Stefano Domenicali, is its own beast. It was completely centrally controlled at the time that CVC came in, because Bernie Eccleston basically ran the whole show. A lot of sports that have traditional administrative structures are very, very different from that. There are different kinds of stakeholders involved who have different sets of responsibilities, whether that's to, grassroots development, or to fan bases who are used to certain traditions, or player bases, or what have you. And I think one of the things that's going to be interesting to follow in how private investment, private equity, venture capital investment works in sport more generally, is where they look around some of these sports and think, how can we make a coherent business? Which bit of this can we buy, trim down, get running as efficiently as possible, and maybe turn it over in 5 or 10 years? Which bits of this are not appropriate for us to deal with, if that is how they approach it, which might be being generous in some cases, not to single out CVC, but where this model could work, basically. And I guess in football, we're seeing a lot of interest in broadcast rights specifically, or in clubs, which again can kind of run as their own entity.
Yeah, I think in rugby, for an example, it's probably going to be in some of the governance of it. I mean, it's quite a confusing structure, isn't it, at the moment with rugby? You've got the World Cup, which happens every 4 years. You've got basically a European Championship, which happens every year, and then you've got a Southern Hemisphere Championship, which is spread across a vast geographical expense. But I mean, they've already. I think one of the kind of interesting things is that they've appointed. It was seen as a bit of a coup for Premiership Rugby when they got in Darren Childs as the CEO, who's touted as someone who could have potentially taken over the Premier League. So I think that's probably where they're going to try and find those inefficiencies in the current system and look for ways to exploit them. I think.
Yeah, and I mean, you could certainly see from a governance perspective, you could see Premiership Rugby maybe sealing up a little bit more. I know they have promotion and relegation, but perhaps you tighten some of the rules around that, however popular that would prove to be. And Six Nations, of course, it completely changes the conversation there about whether you admit Georgia, whether you admit whoever further down the line, and that balance of competitiveness and commercial certainty is going to repeat itself right across the spectrum.
Yeah, again with the kind of at the international stage, they had the Nations Cup this year. And they've been talks forever about what they could do with the nations that sort of autumn slot. And you'd think that if CBC were able to get enough of their fingers in enough of the pies, that they'd probably have a significant say on how that goes and find some areas to make some money there, basically.
Brand transformation, Sam, has been a a big talking point over the last couple of years. It's been a big challenge for lots of organisations whose models not we talk a lot about broadcast media because obviously that's what pays for a lot of professional sport, but in other parts of the sports industry, their models are coming under review. Sportswear being one of the areas that's really been, transformation's been really accelerated over the last 12 months. We've seen, with people being home, retail spaces being closed, big shift to different ways of generating loyalty, direct consumer models, a digitization of brands, and also a differentiation. And I think a company that is going to have some interesting challenges with that is Under Armour. Patrick Frisk, the chief executive, is also on the list.
Yeah. Well, I think obviously, as you kind of mentioned there, I think all of the major sportswear companies last year were hit pretty hard by what was going on. Obviously, as having to close physical retail space and just completely relying on online sales. But I think Under Armour in particular, it seemed a lot of there was kind of a lot of negative news around them. Not just in terms of kind of some of the losses that they were incurring, but having to lay off a lot of staff in the first half of 2020, but also in terms of how it impacted the sports partnership side of their business as well. It's well documented that they're sort of in the midst of a legal dispute now with UCLA over ending their long-term sponsorship contract with them, which I think was, at the time it was signed, the most lucrative in the history of college sports. And then they followed that up by cancelling another one as well. There was also lots of talk about them delaying payments to some of their athlete partners. So yeah, not kind of the ideal year for them. But yeah, towards the end of the year, they were kind of rebounding, as I'm sure, as I think quite a few of the sportswear brands were. But also, they agreed the sale of MyFitnessPal, and it was kind of just obviously sort of a renewed focus for them going into the new year in terms of what they're going to be doing. They're sort of pretty much exclusively focused now, I think, on their performance apparel. That was kind of a big part of that MyFitnessPal sale. So kind of they've, as a sort of challenger brand, I think going into this year is a pretty significant one for them. You look at the way that Nike was able to rebound. Nike is Nike, Adidas is Adidas. The challenge for brands like Under Armour is to keep up with them. So, it's going to be down to Frisk this year to kind of, I think, as Mike put it in the feature, is to sort of come out swinging and make sure that they are sort of keeping track as if they sort of have the ambitions that they did before the pandemic happened.
Yeah, and I was at their European base. I think it was either the end of 2018 or the start of 2019. But they were laying out a 5-year strategy. The first couple of years of which was rationalization and falling back on what their core identity is. Then there's a bit of digitization, then there's expansion. I think what's fascinating with Under Armour is that they expanded very, very quickly, especially in the US, and their eyes lit up. They thought we could take Adidas here and we can start closing on Nike. And it didn't quite happen. And suddenly they went from having a very, very specific identity to one that was quite kind of amorphous. And suddenly they had their fingers in a lot of pies that they hadn't initially intended to get involved with. So they've, part of the exercise is getting back to what it is that Under Armour stands for, and what consumers it's trying to appeal to. Part of it is dealing with the broader questions of any kind of retail brand, when it comes to the changes in the ways that people buy things, and what areas, as you say, Nike is Nike. They can do certain things. They can get involved in media in certain ways. They do their tie up with Apple on connected fitness stuff and all these type of things. Under Armour might have to take a different approach to getting involved in those areas.
You're talking about Nike being able to do certain things because they're Nike. I think it's going to be interesting to track the success of the Curry brand, which Under Armour launched towards the end of last year. Obviously, we've seen the sort of unbelievable success of Nike's partnership with Michael Jordan and his brand. It'll be interesting to see whether something similar can be replicated elsewhere with another very famous basketball player. But does anyone kind of have that same gravitas, that same pull as Michael Jordan? It'll be interesting to see how that pans out.
Since 2008, SportsPro magazine has set the standard for the business of sport in print, and it keeps on getting better. Every quarter, our outstanding editorial team gets under the skin of the industry, talking to the most important leaders and the most influential thinkers around to take you to the heart of what's really happening in sport and what's coming next. We look at the big ideas, the pivotal themes and the crucial numbers, with powerful storytelling, provocative opinion and insightful commentary, as well as guides to the deals, the developments, the destinations and the movers and the shakers. It's your essential industry companion. Head to the shop at sportspromedia.com to subscribe now. SportsPro, connecting and inspiring the business world of sport.
Moving the conversation on, a couple of people who are, I guess, represent different points of the discussion around diversity, around activism, and around social inclusion. They're both going to have pretty big years, we think. Naomi Osaka, world-class tennis player, heading towards an Olympics where she's going to be a very prominent figure, but also someone who has very much found her voice over the last 6 months or so. And then Kim Ang, who is the new general manager of the Miami Marlins. Very experienced figure in the world of baseball, but the first woman to take the top job on the playing side of things. Sam, I mean, you've written a lot about athlete activism. I know you've got some more stuff coming up in the new magazine as well. Let's take Naomi Osaka first of all. What kind of a development has there been in her public profile over the last year?
Pretty monumental, I'd say. It's really, we all knew that she was this unbelievable tennis player, but I think there's been a tendency to kind of think of her as someone who shies away from the spotlight a little bit or doesn't necessarily enjoy being in it. I suppose the first Grand Slam that she won was under a very unique set of circumstances, but it's not kind of the first time that we've seen her sort of hiding behind her visor during a post-match interview. It's sort of, you've often felt like she doesn't really feel comfortable talking about herself that much. But then I think last year what happened was that she really came into her own when she was sort of standing up for other people and kind of, I suppose, giving a voice to the people that don't necessarily have one. So, I think it felt like a pretty big moment in her journey and her career when she did decide to engage in activism, first by wearing masks at the US Open that displayed the names of victims of police brutality and racism, and then she pulled out of her semi-final at the Western and Southern Open following the shooting of Jacob Blake. So yeah, she almost kind of underwent this transformation from a sort of shy up-and-comer to a brave, articulate young woman who was really embracing her role both as an athlete and as a leader on societal issues. And I think what was really interesting as well is that you probably shouldn't forget that she was doing this in an individual sport, whereas I think a lot of the focus last year was on the collective power of athletes. There was a lot of focus on how the NBA as a whole was responding, the WNBA, whereas she was out there on her own. So she kind of had a lot more to lose in a sense, because had she lost at that US Open, it would have been really easy for critics of her to say it was because of her activism that distracted her from the sport. But the fact she kind of both of those, her performance and her activism, kind of grew hand in hand, I think made it all the more impressive and kind of bodes really well for her going into this year.
And I mean, just generally that area of the sports industry, that crossover between what athletes are doing publicly, activism, the involvement of the organisations that are around them. That's teams in a lot of cases. In Naomi's, it's obviously slightly different, but it's perhaps her tour and sponsors and whoever else. What are some of the things that we're going to be looking out for in 2021?
Well, I think that it's going to be interesting because obviously Brands League is going to start to see that there's value to be had from investing now in athletes who do have a social cause, who do want to incorporate political messaging into their brand. But I think there's also obviously risks to that as well. I think there was a really good article in the Financial Times, I think it was last week. It was a bit of a deep dive into Nike, and obviously, as we know, they're never particularly shy from incorporating social messaging into their marketing. But I think there's the FT article was saying there's been a little bit of pushback from within the company from employees who work there from minority backgrounds to kind of ensure that the company is addressing those issues internally before kind of incorporating it into their marketing. So I think that's going to be really interesting in the sense that, as we do see a lot of these brands try and get involved in this sort of side of things, at the same time, athletes are going to be, I think they're going to be a lot more picky over who they ultimately partner with. They're going to be a lot more conscious of it because they are putting themselves out there, so they want to know that these brands aren't just using them as a kind of quick win. It is going to have to be, I hate using this word, but it is going to have to be authentic. So it is going to have to, the way they portray themselves outwardly is going to have to be a reflection of of their internal practices as well. And I think also in the case of Osaka, it's interesting because as keenly as she's followed in the US, where she's a resident, her mother's from Japan. She was born in Japan, so her progress is tracked really keenly over there. And you mentioned Tokyo 2020 already, and the impact she might have. It's also going to be interesting to see kind of how her fan base over there reacts to this kind of new role as an activist that she's taken on. It is quite divisive. It can be polarizing at times when an athlete decides to adopt a political stance. The FT did another article actually where it was talking about the response among some of her Japanese sponsors. Apparently, some senior executives kind of held emergency internal meetings to discuss sort of the impact of her activism for their brands. So, there's a lot of it's a complex thing. It's not as easy as kind of just jumping on the back of it because there's been a positive response. It is something that brands are going to have to tread carefully with and make sure that they are doing it authentically.
Yeah, and I think, as you say, there's going to be a demand from people that these things they come from an authentic place. And really, we're talking as well, guys, about changes to the way that sport is run, to the people who are doing that running, which brings us onto Kim Ang, who is taking on a high profile role with the Miami Marlins. It's a milestone within Major League Baseball, but it also feels like something that is going to make people think again a bit about the kinds of jobs that women in other sports are more than capable of doing. I mean, there are already people on the cusp of taking this kind of job in the NBA. We have seen in the past female football managers, but there is nothing to stop really an experienced female coach or an experienced female executive in football taking on a director of football or a head coach role at some point in the future.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting story, this one. Kim Ang starting out as an intern at the White Sox 30 years ago now, held roles with the Yankees and the Dodgers. and then has interviewed for a general manager role on several occasions since 2005, only to be turned down. And I suppose when that's happening, and you've got all of those qualifications, it does start to raise a question of, am I not getting this job because I'm not the right person for the role, or is it because I'm not the right gender for the role? And I think this hire, and even her position on this in this feature, actually, it's interesting because obviously her decisions don't hold the same global influence as some of the other people on this. But I think the fact that she is there is kind of, as you say, it does have global implications. It is globally significant because it does kind of, the old adage goes, if you can't see it, you can't be it. So the fact that she kind of has smashed through that glass ceiling now, sort of, it does sort of open up a whole new path for, young girls in a lot of places who do aspire to have a career in the sports industries, and they can sort of like now hold her up as a role model for someone to aspire to. And I think also as we're talking about this, it's obviously a relevant point for a lot of sporting organisations who are talking about they're promising to implement more diverse hiring practices, for example. But I think what the hire of Kim Ang sort of shows, it's not necessarily about just committing to doing something like that. That's by doing that, it doesn't mean just going out and hiring people from different backgrounds, different cultures. What I think it ultimately means is that you hire people on merit rather than their background. I think that's, you get from her story a sense that all she kind of wanted during this time was to be interviewed based on her qualifications rather than the fact that she was a woman, rather than the fact that she was from that she was of Chinese descent or whatever else. So I think that's kind of the main takeaway from her inclusion in this, is that as sports do look to make their hiring practices more diverse, that doesn't necessarily just mean going out and, as I say, as I was sort of making the point of before, it's sort of it's about sort of hiring based on a person's qualifications rather than anything else.
Yeah, well said. And creating the structures that allows the right talent to be identified.
This is the SportsPro Podcast.
Right, we have arguably, I'd say inarguably, left the most powerful person on this list to the end. Yoshihide Suga is the new Prime Minister of Japan. He is going to make a lot of the key decisions about what happens, what kind of Olympic Games are going to be possible. It's probably pretty close to the top of his list of priorities, although there are some much more important ones for him over the next few months. But I think it's a reminder, Tom, of just how significant a challenge COVID is going to remain for anyone putting on any kind of event, any kind of international collaboration, anything involving travel over the next year.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the fact that what we're less than 200 days, I think. Is it less than 200 days yet?
It's less than 200 days, yeah.
Ah, yes, as it helpfully says here in our article. Um, less than 200 days from the start of the Olympics, and no one yet knows really whether or not there's going to be like fans allowed in, athletes allowed in. Yeah, so many questions that you'd think you'd have to know the answer to at this point. We don't, and we've got a new Prime Minister of Japan who might have very different ideas about what he thinks is appropriate compared to his predecessor, who certainly made the Olympics a big part of what of what he thought was going to be his legacy, and end up turning out to be potentially a massive burden on the country. So yeah, it will be very interesting to see how it all shakes out. I mean, from our sort of news conferences, it feels like every week someone brings in a new Japanese poll about how many people don't want the Olympics to happen. So it's facing not just kind of pressure from sort of uncontrollable virus, but also pressure from the public in order to kind of say, is this something that we think is appropriate? And yeah, the Japanese population seems to be suggesting that actually it doesn't.
Yeah, never plan anything to be your legacy, I think is one point in all this. Shinzo Abe very much wanted to go out with the Olympic Games as his swan song.
You could do with taking some lessons from Boris and just be like taking credit for other people's legacies. It's a much better way of going about it.
Well, there you go, and certainly an opportunity for Yoshihide Suga to, if he can pull this off, that's a pretty solid first 18 months. But state of emergency, Sam, declared in Tokyo, in the Tokyo region last week. I think things are not as severe there as they are here in the UK, but some concerning numbers and a need to take some pretty significant measures. It's going to be a question of prioritization, communication, collaboration, all the things, all those big consultancy things, and leadership.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I think leadership is the big one. I mean, it's poor bloke. I mean, it's starting to feel a little bit like March again, isn't it? In terms of the sort of direction of travel and the news which keeps coming out of the host nation. But as you say, I think leadership's the main thing in terms of the way it was handled this time last year with the IOC in particular. It felt like there was a lot of sitting on hands. Yeah, I think it's just going to be, clarity in the messages are going to be really important because, as I say, last time round, there were conflicting messages coming out of the IOC and the host nation. So, it's going to be a massive challenge. But I think something that a lot of people accept now is that this Olympics isn't going to look like how we expected it to this time last year. Suga has kind of he's reiterated on several occasions now that he's promised, I should say, that these Olympics are going to go ahead. And, if they do, fair play to him in whatever form they do take. Because I think at this stage, as we look at it, just being able to get some form of Olympics done and dusted would be an achievement.
I think as well, we can expect maybe over the next 4 or 5 years, the shape of any event to be a little bit different. Both economic reasons, the security of travel, as different countries come out of this crisis at different speeds, and what an event looks like when it can deliver for a host is that's going to be an important thing for the sports industry to be able to reset and to sell, I guess, for want of a better expression, in the years ahead.
Yeah, but I think one thing that could be interesting is, as you said, as people kind of return to sporting events. I mean, there was kind of a feeling, probably, I don't know, when they were scratching around for hosts of certain events, that maybe it wasn't quite as appealing as it used to be. But maybe in a post-pandemic world where people have spent a whole year and a half of their lives sat inside, not being able to see anyone, it could be something that people are very keen to return to. I mean, I'm basing this entirely off my own kind of thoughts about it, but for me, it does seem like a kind of logical next step. Actually, maybe it will be a rebuilding tool for some places who want to gain investment and will look to do it like that. And people might be very willing to get on board with that kind of idea.
And with climate change and the other challenges that we have, I mean, that's the biggest one. But with the remodeling that we're going to have to do in the way we do anything at scale, any kind of innovation, any kind of any upside, I guess, is going to be very welcome. Okay, I think we have we've about covered that list. Lots of meat on that, lots of themes to get into. There are more of them covered in the new issue of SportsPro magazine, which you should be seeing any day now. I know that it will be with the printers around about the time that you hear this. The theme is influence in 2021. So some of these topics and plenty more covered in much greater depth there. You'll see a bit more of that across sportspromedia.com as well, I'm sure, over the next few weeks. But for now, I'd like to say thank you to Sam Carp.
Cheers, Eoin.
And to Tom Bassam.
Thanks, Eoin. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks to all of you for listening, and we'll be back with you again very soon. Bye-bye.
The SportsPro podcast is published by SportsPro Media. The producer is Ed Dixon.